I want to welcome on the program today one of the world's leading experts on Greenland. Her book, So You Want to Own Greenland, is a must read. I'm in the midst of reading it right now. It's accessible, it's brilliant, and it traces the history of Greenland. Thank you, Dr. Buchanan, for your time. Your book actually opens with exactly this formulation. Everybody's talking about Greenland. Very few people know anything about it. And going through everything you've said and written, you seem to say that there is logic in why the United States is eyeing Greenland. Trump is not the first American leader to do so. You document how Harry Truman once offered, after the Second World War, to purchase Greenland in $100 million worth of gold. So Trump isn't just being Trump here. The problem is, after what's happened with Venezuela, there is a sense that Trump could actually do this. How do you look at, first, before we get into your book, how do you look at the overall claims by Trump to get Greenland by hook or crook?
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I think it is so important that we inject some reality and some historical facts into the discourse that is Greenland. It is not lost on me how hilarious it is for a Greenland expert to be in Australia. You probably couldn't get further away unless you're in New Zealand. But I think with the distance comes a sense of perspective. So for me, as a polar geopolitical expert and watcher, I just look at a map, and that's what Donald Trump has done. Put aside the idea that, he is a grand strategic master and thinker and politician. He is not. He is a businessman first and foremost. So anybody looking at a map of the world, thinking about the Western Hemisphere, which we know Donald Trump will now prioritize for the US national interest, squarely puts Greenland at the heart of that theatre. So the idea that this is, as you correctly underscore in your lead-in, the idea that this is somehow a concoction of the mind, that Trump has kind of woken up one morning and thought America will have Greenland, for me, it's a misreading of the facts on the ground. So we've had US military presence on Greenland for over 70 years. And this is something that, the Danes, but also Europe has requested, has supported, has relied upon. The US military footprint and the base there, the Badufik space base, is essentially the insurance policy for European security. It was the insurance policy, all of the sort of early warning radar systems and capabilities that are there, that are paid for by the US, that are manned and staffed by the US, are monitored by the US. This is a situation that has origins in the Cold War. In fact, in World War II. So the idea that this is an unwelcome development in international politics, I think, is a fascinating thing to follow that discourse for a moment, because I think it speaks to how quickly the issue of Greenland came back on the radar so quickly after Venezuela, because I think it was the sheer shock of things. This, seems like a gamble. It seems like an odd grab for the Trump administration. But for me, it's pragmatic policy for any US leader when it comes to Greenland. And in my book, I unpack, I guess, the historical issues that are there with Greenland and with Denmark. And, the Danish government still treats Greenland as a colony. It might not do it in name. It is referred to as a self-autonomous, semi-independent territory of the Danish kingdom. But in reality, when you are underwriting an entire community's, ecosystem and livelihood, your schools, your hospitals, your pensions, that's coercive. It is up to the Greenlandic people, first and foremost, to decide their fate. And that, I think, is getting missed in the discourse right now. It is not about Trump abandoning Europe. It is about Trump putting pressure on the Danes to pull forward this discussion about Greenlandic independence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I'll come to the history of Greenland, the fact that there is a long history of colonization from the Vikings to the Danes in a moment. And your book is a very important chronicle of that. But just to pick up on contemporary politics, one of the points that you have made, and this speaks to Trump being a pragmatic businessman first and foremost, is not just the security importance of Greenland to the United States of America, but also critical minerals. And I think you wrote that the critical mineral reserves in Greenland may be so voluminous that it would help America overtake China if America were to get control of these minerals. So let's also understand, and you're the best person to explain this to us, Greenland in the context of the G2 or the G3 world that Trump imagines, where the two great powers will be America and China, maybe to a lesser degree Russia. I want you to explain Greenland to our audience in that context.
Yeah, so in the strategic kind of prize, if you can, about when it comes to Greenland, yes, we're talking about critical minerals, which, you know, the ability to own the future of technology, to own the chip supply chain and development chain, but also the race for AI, right? So it's not just what's in the ground, which is very important, right? It's also in the Arctic Ocean region, in the offshore region of Greenland that reaches out under the North Pole. You've got vast hydrocarbons, so oil and gas, right? But beyond the critical minerals there on the actual Greenlandic ice mass, you have the basic geography of Greenland that is vastly populated, which you mentioned before, but it's also extremely cold. Now, if you think about all of the server farms, if you think about all of the computer power that you need to run the next generation of the AI race, right, for global data, the idea that you could set up or control mass amounts of server farms to give the computing edge for this next arc of strategic competition means that if you've got access to a vast vacant space that is Greenland, you develop modular nuclear technology, which we know the US is cracking on with. You can power these. You've got limited people that you can upset in terms of noise and output. So there's so many other aspects to this in terms of Greenland not only being a geostrategic prize, but also the resources that come with it. Another key resource is its proximity to what I would call the Panama Canal 2.0. So the issues that you have in the Panama Canal in South America are mirrored completely in the Arctic Ocean. So you have at one end the choke point in the Bering Sea between Alaska and Russia, so the US and Russia, to enter the Arctic Ocean, thinking about how this new Arctic route will absolutely fundamentally change global transportation. It is cheaper. It is quicker to get goods from Asia to Europe. That is the future. India, we know, have cottoned onto that. So have the UAE. The huge DP World shipping firms are now working where they can along this new, Arctic sea route. But the other end, as per the Panama Canal, there's two ends to that choke point. You've got Alaska, but you've also got Greenland. If you think of the GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap. So you simply cannot allow, a window to open, which in the Western Hemisphere we know has been happening when it comes to Chinese presence everywhere. You cannot allow a window to open in which China can fill that vacuum and really, get presence, get boots on the ground and control one end of a choke point like the Arctic Circle. It might not matter in 5-10 years, the ice is still very thick. It's still an environmentally hazardous place to drill, to extract resources. But what Trump understands in his business-minded commercial sense of the world is it's not the 10-year game, it's the 25 to 50-year game. And that's where China is best at its, long-term diversification planning. And I think Trump has come in, had a look at a map and realized that what was the American century or unipolar moment is over. So how do you prolong that?
So what you describe is a set of very good reasons why Trump would be interested, or the United States would be interested in Greenland. You also said this is not about Trump abandoning Europe, but it is also, there has to be pressure on Denmark to evaluate what the people of Greenland want. But
Yeah.
how do you
Yeah.
see the
Yeah.
response of Europe? Europe
Mm.
has, in a somewhat feeble way, I would argue, issued a
Mhm.
kind of statement that if the Americans do this, we will stand together. But the fact is that what has happened
Mhm.
vis-a-vis Venezuela, what has happened with Trump now talking about possibly acting in Mexico, possibly
Yep.
acting in Iran, is that Trump is showing that he's not going to go by conventional norms of global negotiation, right?
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
see do you see a military scenario unfolding in Greenland? What do you see? What do you
Mm.
foresee
So
happening?
I think it is absolutely the case that we can't take it off the table. I think anything's possible, but also the big takeaway, I think, from the discourse around European reactions and panic over the Trump statement, that is basically a confirmation of geography, is the idea that the US is the beacon, or has been long the beacon, of the liberal rules-based order, of which international law and norms are king, and there's clear lines, and they have essentially panicked over the fact that Trump has ripped up that rule book, and he's not asking for forgiveness. So we had also today JD Vance
Mhm.
mention that there are, long-standing friends and allies and partners of the US, but that doesn't factor into their current considerations when they're looking at US interests in the world. And it's a case of, um, for Australia, I guess the big thing is, we have the US alliance as a cornerstone of our defense strategy. And we've just been woken up to the reality that if you don't pay your way, or if it is not beneficial for this cost benefit analysis mindset of the US president, you will be left behind. So you mentioned the European statement, which was fascinating to read, because it was, you know, I think it was less than 8 US leaders actually put their names to this statement, and one that was missing was the Finns. Now,
Mm.
Finland, to not be on that statement was quite damning, considering they are one of the key Nordic powers, right? Traditionally and today. Of course, during the last 3 years of the Ukraine war, you've had Europe pivot away from Russian LNG to a complete reliance, 60% of all of Europe, on US LNG. But the Finns are 91% reliant on US LNG today. So, point is, Europe doesn't have any cards, and they know it, But in one breath, and this is also why I think Trump has acted in such a brash way as well, because he realizes that Europe has no leverage. Now, Europe is faced with a two-front war right now. They are desperate and require US assurances for the Ukraine war peace deal, for any Ukraine solution. So, on one hand, they are demanding that the US endorses and assures any, resolution on that front. But on the other hand, they're now saying, well, you couldn't possibly want to do anything with Greenland.
Yeah.
So the dissonance is crazy, but also I think Europe is now awakening to this new normal. The Danes have been the Danish government have been very interesting with this issue, because any attention on on Greenland as a problem and as a challenge is bad news for Denmark, because Denmark doesn't want to have to deal with the fact that it has in its own constitution the ability for the Greenlandic people to become independent. Now, there is, and my book goes through some fine print, it's very coercive. For instance, if the Greenlandic people hold a referendum, of which we know consistent polling shows overwhelming, and the current government in Greenland, the parliament in Greenland, are moving towards independence. So it's not a case of if we'll be independent, it's just when, right? The
Mm.
timeline, it has to happen. That's what the platform is. But the fine print in the Danish constitution, and the amendment to do with Greenland, is that any results of the referendum for independence must be approved by the Danish parliament. So, why would the Danish government carve off its healthy leg? Greenland affords the Danish realm 95% of its territory. just by sheer size. If you extend on the seabed resources, the geographical proximity, the history of Denmark basically saying to NATO and to the US, we give you free rent and use of Greenland, so we're not going to pay anymore because, so it's a difficult position for the Danes to be in, but also going internal to this issue and taking a step back from the global geopolitical issue of Greenland, there is a deep discussion that's underway in the domestic discourse between the Danes and the Greenlandic people. And there are Danish millennials, friends of mine, who are horrified that they still have basically a light colony that is treated this way. So it's an affront to, I guess, the Danish kind of Scandinavian values as well. So what Trump has done basically is lit a fire under a process that has been underway. And so now it's just a question of how this is resolved. And I see two ways for resolving this. Military might, sure. Military action could be something that Trump pulls out of the bag, but at the end of the day, the idea that Europe would then leave NATO is nonsensical because NATO is the US, let's be honest. But also, people forget that the Danes only have one helicopter and less than 100 people.
They have only one helicopter.
Right,
they have one helicopter on Greenland.
And they also have, I think it's 16 dog sleds. So, they could try, but also in a serious comment, everything that the Danish army and the military-industrial complex has is US kit. They've just signed off on ordering F-35s. They've just ordered P-8 Poseidons. Everything that most of the European armies have, from machine guns to helmets to extreme weather gear, is coming from the US. So I think we need to be serious that won't be something that will be forced upon the region in terms of a firing conflict over Greenland. And as I said, Europe is wedged. So you've got leaders, you've got Macron, who is now talking about, having to break away basically and accept the fact that the US is quote unquote trashing the international rules-based order. So what Europe does in response, I think, is it's got limited options, but Greenland, I think, will be currently having some really interesting bilateral discussions with the White House as to what their demands are. Essentially, it might be a monetary figure. But I do think the priority for the Washington elites right now is to cut the Danes out of this discussion, and quick.